doing this live is that people come in, and so we'll kind of talk, and then we'll officially start, and I'll do the intro, and then we'll run the podcast, and then the podcast will end. We'll still be live, and then I'll close out the show. So it's like a false start, false ending. Fun times.
I'm going to see if this commenting thing works because, yeah, we are streaming all over the place right now.
Can you comment as yourself?
Let me see.
So, Max, there's a comment section where you should be able to. Oh goodness, you commented twice as yourself and James. So in the comments area, you can see the comments on each of the channels that we're broadcasting to, and so you can broadcast to all of them at once. Usually, what I'll do is I'll have Twitch open in a tab and YouTube open in a tab, so I can respond to those individually if I need to. Because if I respond here, I'm not sure if you can or not, but if I respond here, I'm going to come across as James or Brad. Whereas if I go on over to Twitch, then I look like myself. What's up, Christian and Robin? Good to see you guys. Actually, I don't know if Robin is a girl or a boy. Sorry, Robin. But Christian's been hanging out with us quite a bit lately, which has been fun.
This is totally working. If I type in the chat, it goes everywhere. But like I'm James in James's stream and me in my stream.
Oh, interesting.
It's weird. So like it authenticates as the person.
That's nice. It's just here that it looks like you were
commenting 4 times.
Posting 4 times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So for people jumping in, we are experimenting right now with broadcasting to James's channels and Brad's channels. So there's 4 places you can catch us. It's like having a party in James's house with James gone. So super fun. Oh man.
So you guys have got amazing setups for this. I'm quite jealous.
This has been fun. So we had traditionally just been streaming to Twitch, and then James changed his affiliate status so that we could broadcast on both YouTube and Twitch at the same time. And we've had quite a bit more engagement. And some of that is just because of the number of followers that he has on YouTube. So, and it's been fun to have live engagement while we're recording and then have additional, like a long tail of engagement after the episode actually publishes. What is this? So what this is we are going to be recording a live episode of Compressed, and we have Max as our guest this week. So Max has quite the credentials. We're excited to have him join us, and I can get more into that as we start the show. We'll give it a few more minutes.
I have a co-worker streaming it next to me, and I can see the lag.
So fun.
Yeah.
It's too much.
Yeah, I usually have it on in another tab, and it's kind of strange.
Yeah, it's pretty quick, but noticeable. A few seconds.
Okay, here we go. Cool. Awesome. Excited. So yeah, we don't Brad is posing as James today. So as I was saying, we're having a party in his house with him gone, which is the best party to have. Oh man. Oh, good deal. Well, we can go ahead and get started. I know some people are going to continue to trickle in. Yeah. It will be fun. So I was just saying we have kind of like a false start, and then we actually start recording. So this will be the actual start recording. Okay. So welcome to another episode of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web design and development with a little bit of zest. Today I have my co-host, Brad Garapy.
Hey, y'all. I'm Brad Garapy.
And I also have Max as as a guest. And so Max is behind Homebrew and TXYZ. So we're super excited to have him on as well.
Hey, great to be here.
Awesome. So we also have two sponsors, Hashnode and Daily.dev. So Hashnode is a fantastic blogging platform where you can put any content that you would like, and Daily.dev is a great way to extend that. So Daily.dev is a Chrome extension, or at least that's how I consume it, where it will highlight the latest and greatest news in tech, and it is customized specifically for you. So you can write your blog on Hashnode and then publish it and get further reach on daily.dev. So special thanks to Hashnode and daily.dev for being a Compressed FM sponsor. So we can get into it. Brad, you have a few questions lined up. Do you want to start?
Yeah, well, welcome to the show, Max. I think you have like a really, really awesome track record. So if you don't mind, can you just give us like some major career highlights for you at this point in time?
Sure. So I did a chemistry degree some time ago. I always thought I wanted to be a scientist. You know, I watched movies like Back to the Future, and I wanted to invent the time machine and change the world. So I did a master's in it, and in the third year I did this year in industry, where I got to see what working in chemistry was really like, and I realized that actually chemistry is really boring, and I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And I fell into this kind of depressed funk, moved back in with my parents, and fell back on a hobby which I never really considered as a career, which was programming. My dad taught me how to program when I was 6. He wasn't a programmer. He just dabbled in lots of things. You know, he used to hang in the garage and like work on electronics and gadgets and building things. And so when like computers became a thing, he bought one. The computer we had was this BBC Micro. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, made computers, surprisingly, and it booted to a programming prompt. So like it was really easy to get into it. So it was just always a hobby. So I fell back on it and got into open source and started working on apps on Linux. And through the apps, I managed to get some attention from a startup in London called Last.fm. So I managed to get myself into the industry indirectly. So I never had a computer science degree, never really studied it like properly, just self-taught, figured it out. And it was while at Last.fm that I was working on the apps there. They had 6 apps for Linux, Windows, Mac, Apple, iPhone, and BlackBerry, of all things. And we used a lot of different open source, and the build systems all sucked, and working on them all together was like really difficult. So that was how I got the inspiration for making Homebrew, which is my biggest contribution to the world for sure. Like, would be my career highlight.
Man, that's awesome. Like, so like what kind of open source stuff were you working on that grabbed the attention of Last.fm? Like, I totally remember using Last.fm to like track all the songs I listened to and all that stuff.
Yeah, Last.fm still exists, but it was its heyday about 2007 or so, which is when I joined. So before that, for a few years, I've been working on this app called Amarok with a few other people, and it was a music app. And at the time, it was really good, honestly. I used to, there was 3 of us who were the main people working on it, and we were in different parts of the world, and we just communicated over IRC, which is this geeky text chat format. But at the time, there wasn't really much that was better. And honestly, I miss it in many ways. It was a special place to hang out with people. And so, I've said this to other people in the past, but like in a way, like I started with remote work, with programming, and so that's always been like my default. Like the people I worked with were in different time zones around the world. Asynchronous work was the norm. Working via, I didn't even meet some of these people ever. I never saw their faces. All I knew was their alias that they'd carefully chosen.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was a really cool music player. Like we pioneered some things that have been copied since. Like really just the idea of like there is more to music than just the sound of it. So we'd like bring in like other sources of information to try and supplement that experience. So yeah, it was cool, and like Last.fm liked it. So they were like, okay, Max, you have the skills actually that we're looking for, and we really like what you've done. So why don't you come and have a job? And so like, It's what I've barely ever had any software interviews either for technical interviews for positions, and that was my first job, and they didn't interview me. My open source was sufficient. You look at that and you're like, okay, well, yeah, he's built something, so this is the sort of thing we want. This will do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wish interviews were like that, where like I do so much work online and it's like, just look at my GitHub, go to the sites I've made, and then you can make your decision. I don't need to prove anything else.
Yeah.
That's
Or
how
it's
I
just a
interview
culture.
now.
It's just a culture fit at that point to see is your personality match with us.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
So-
exactly. Like I interview that way now as much as possible, but it can, the people who have good GitHubs are difficult to find and get. It's true.
So I feel like a lot of people, when they think about open source, they think about these very small foundational packages, but that are leveraged by like much bigger applications. But you were actually building a real application in the open, I take it?
Yeah, that's how I got into it. Like the first open source that I worked on was this little tool called FileLight, I called it. I've always been one for like spending way too long on names of things. So I spent longer figuring out the name for that app than I did coding it mostly. But it was a disk usage analyzer. So that got me into it. And then I discovered that Linux is just full of people who are all working together on open source and trying to make things. I don't use Linux really at all anymore, apart from on the server. I switched to Mac after a few years, which is a reasonable story in itself. Yeah, so it started with apps. Really, in many ways, I've always been an apps kind of person. I almost did design instead of chemistry. I had a scholarship for design. It's the equivalent of high school. And I probably should have done it, but it's just as well I didn't, things would have been very different. Certainly there wouldn't have been a homebrew. Hopefully someone would have made something else that was similar in scope and reach, but
Yeah, so that's good. You're taking this approach to like building open source software where you're thinking about them a little bit more as products instead of like these little bricks that people can take and use for themselves. So I guess you got to Last FM and you noticed a need for kind of sharing software between different applications.
Well, the package manager is this unique tool that every developer needs. And as my co-founder at T will tell you, that if you want me to do something, just frustrate me. And it's basically true. If I find something frustrating enough, I immediately start figuring out why I'm frustrated and whether or not I have the time to build something that will alleviate my frustrations. And this is part of the reason I liked working on Homebrew so much, is because I love building tools that make it easier for me and everyone else to make better things, better tools, better apps. I just want people to, accelerate the rate of human progress. And if that means that I have to dedicate years of my life to making tools that facilitate that, then I consider that like a good use of my time.
Yeah. So for folks who aren't familiar, brew or homebrew, and I want to talk about the difference. There's those two terms. I think one is the CLI command and one is the actual name of the application or something. But it's a package manager. So can you kind of give us a definition of what a package manager is for those who may not know?
Yeah. I hate defining it because it makes it sound so boring.
But the impact is huge.
Yeah, the impact's huge.
Yeah, it's fundamental infrastructure for software development, all kinds. Doesn't really matter what kind you're working on, open or closed, amateur or commercial. You need a package manager, and without it, you'll just spend inordinate amount of time setting up your environment. Essentially, it is just a tool that installs other tools, so it's extremely meta. And the problem with open source, though, is it's this huge graph of dependencies. I talk about open source as this tower of bricks, somewhat referencing the XKCD comic called Dependency, which is worth Googling for. But essentially, open source has been, since the inception of modern software engineering, let's say the 70s, for like the people who make Unix. every time someone has made something useful, generally they put it on the internet for everyone to use, because there is something about software people. We just like software to be free. If you don't, then you don't get very far in it. So they put it on the internet, everyone liked it, and then it became like this vital piece of the tower. Everything else after was built on top of that. And that just keeps happening, keeps continuously. Like, it's basically impossible at this point to remove some of those lower bricks. But because it's this tower and like bits of it relate to each other all over the place, it's like a spider's web of dependencies. And some of those dependencies depend on themselves recursively, which it makes it very difficult if you don't have a tool that can manage that. And these things are being updated continuously. Like Homebrew at this point, I think it's got like 20 to 30,000 packages in it. And then you've got like Debian with like almost 80,000. And then nowadays you've got like package managers for programming languages like Rust, the programming language that's hopefully going to replace C++. Has a package manager called Cargo, and it has over 100,000 packages in it. So anyway, you can't manage this stuff by yourself. You need a tool, and you need a tool that understands how these version relations happen and what can be updated, and then tries to help you by not updating everything at once, so everything on your computer breaks, and then tries to make it so everything on your computer doesn't break even when everything has to update, etc. So yeah, that's what it's for.
There's so many more problem solving that goes on behind the scenes that most people don't even think about. I just know I run the command and it works.
Yeah, exactly. Like, honestly, if I'd known how complicated it was before I started Brew, I probably wouldn't have done it. Like, I find that's an extremely common thing that people who've made big open source tools say. Like, I love the quote from the guy who did PHP. It's something along the lines of, I wasn't trying to make a programming language. I was just putting things together and making what I needed, and then it became a programming language. And yeah, like I didn't realize how complicated packaging was, but I embraced the complexity, and because I was just determined to make something that worked.
Yeah, but I think that's goes to your point that some of the most successful things that are out there are where people are just trying to solve a problem for themselves. You know, forget about everybody else or forget about trying to monetize it. You just had a problem that needed to be solved.
Yeah, definitely. Like you have to be able to dog food, like whatever you're making, be it a product that you're trying to monetize or open source, or even cooking in your kitchen. If you don't dog food it, you don't really know for sure. Like you can try and harvest that feedback, but it's just not the same, and you won't have the same kind of inspiration. Like working on Brew continuously, I knew what else I needed because I was using it. And that's something I always try to do as well. I try to build with the thing I'm building. So like tea is the successor to Brew that we'll talk about soon, I'm sure. And I use tea to build tea, and I did that from like very, very early on. Even though it was very difficult to do that early on, I was determined to do it. And then like when I was working on Amarok, initially when I worked on Amarok, the music player, you couldn't run two versions of it at the same time. So in order to actually listen to music, you had to use a different app. And I was like, this is ridiculous. We need to be listening to music with the app we're making. Otherwise, we don't know if it's any good or not. So I spent like a week hacking it so you could run two versions at once. And like that just massively improved what we could do with the app, what we were doing with the app, what we knew it needed.
So back a few minutes ago, you were talking about like how there's lots of different package managers, even some specific to languages. Why is that the case? Why are there so many package managers, and what's different between them?
Yeah, well, I agree. There shouldn't be so many. So like T is meant to be, we're calling it the unified package manager, and we're trying to come at it from the perspective that, at least for development purposes anyway, there shouldn't be lots of them. But that's an aside. The reason there is so many is because, well, despite the fact reinventing the wheel is like a common criticism of software engineering, I think software engineers just love reinventing the wheel. They always think that they can do it better, always. And sometimes they do, to be fair. Like, it's because with software you can build things so quickly and experiment so fast. And there's very little cost to trying things out. You wouldn't reinvent the wheel in your workshop with real physical materials because it's costly and time consuming, and you probably need tools that you don't even have and you've got to buy them, etc. But software makes it easy. But still, that's not a complete answer. Every Linux distribution tends to have its own package manager. And this is partly because open source is so complicated. There's so many little pieces and they can all be infinitely customized to your heart's content. And so in many ways, the package manager is the differentiating factor for Linux distributions. That's really what it comes down to. So why is there so many on Mac? Well, you know, when I made Brew, there was 2 major package managers for Mac. But I didn't think either of them were very good, at least for what I needed. Like for a time, the tagline for Brew was Mac ports driving you to drink, try Homebrew, which we thought was very clever. But in the end, we removed it because we became so big and so popular that it stopped being funny and started being like kind of mean, like rubbing it in. But it was good. But yeah, so Mac ports just wasn't very good for development, and I think the same basically. Mac ports had some major issues. So it's just the age-old thing with software. It's like something isn't good enough for your needs, so let's make a new one. And that seems ridiculous as well, doesn't it? Because like open source is meant to be about contributions. So what you're meant to do, right, is you're meant to go up to the Mac ports GitHub, well, there wasn't GitHub at the time, and say, hey, I think it should be this way. But you know what happens most of the time when you do that? And maybe you've tried. I don't know. Have you ever tried to actually do a major contribution to something?
You get that answer that's like that's
no.
not the way it is. Yeah,
yeah.
That's going to be hard.
No. And I actually have a lot of sympathy for those no's, because it is often the person who's come in with the contribution idea doesn't have the big picture. You have the big picture. You have a holistic overview of your entire product, what it's doing, where you're going, what you're working on now, and it maybe doesn't fit. And also, it's like you have to maintain that stuff. Now, I'm fairly good at accepting contributions, even if I think it's going to be extra work for me in the long run, because I really value the fact that people come to my projects and say, hey, I want to do some free work for you. Really appreciate that. But I do sympathize with people who just do not have the time or energy to do that. And so they come across they come across very mean when they turn it down, especially if they're curt. They're often curt because they don't have time. When Brew was at its peak, I was getting thousands of messages a week. And so I inherited this attitude of being a dick, basically. And, well, I'm not really, but I didn't have time for everybody, and it became frustrating and difficult and stressful.
Yeah, at times open source maintainers can really have their backs against the wall with the flood of messages, issues, feature requests, everything coming in, with the expectation that it's done for free, right? So
yeah, there is certainly some element of entitlement that you see. But I wouldn't say it's everybody. Some people react very negatively to it.
Did you have somebody helping you maintain that project, or were you trying to answer all 1,000 messages by yourself?
Yeah. Well, with Homebrew, I was lucky in that it inspired people very quickly. So very quickly, I had a lot of help. 3 or 4 people within 3 or 4 months were doing, a lot of work. I had quit last Feb to work on Homebrew full time because it was just great. I loved it. You don't get many opportunities in life where suddenly you realize you've made something that instrumental and with so much reach. And that was very early as well, when probably only a few thousand people were using it, but it was still epic in how it was forming. But yeah, I had quite a few people turn up to work on it, including a friend that I met while working on Linux called Mike McQuaid, who still is the core maintainer of Homebrew to this day. But at the time, he sent me an email. He's like, hey, Max, Homebrew looks cool. Do you mind if I help? I was like, please help. Why? You know, you don't need to ask. But well, in a way, like I get why he did that. It's because he was asking me to acknowledge that he was going to be more dedicated than just like a casual contribution. And yeah, obviously, you know, he works in it full time now. Well, more or less. GitHub hired him in the end, and quite a few of the core maintainers who still work on it, you know, have been hired by GitHub. So good on them.
So you were saying that there was like a really big adoption with Brew. What do you think was like the differentiator that set it apart? Like, why were people gravitating towards it?
A lot of factors, and like a historian, like the first one is luck. That's what I've taught in history. That luck is always a factor in these things. So no, yeah, there was certainly some luck, possibly because of timing. Like GitHub was fairly new. Git was fairly new. This was 2009. So I think GitHub had been around like for a couple of years at this point and was starting to gain a lot of traction because those of us who were in software before GitHub remember SourceForge, which was basically the only alternative before GitHub. And SourceForge is as bad today as it ever was. It's not good. And SourceForge didn't support Git, and like everyone was trying to use Git because we were fed up with the previous version control systems that came before that just weren't great, but the Git was like impossible to learn. It's a lot better nowadays, and there's a lot more information out there to help you. But also, like Stack Overflow was fairly new at this point as well. So you know, looking for answers to things was difficult. But anyway, so Brew turned up. Sorry.
How did we code before then?
I remember like spending hours with a manual, like a little paper manual.
Yes, O'Reilly books.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. Trying to find the answers to these things. Like I got given a C++ compiler for my 13th birthday. It was Semantic C++ version 7, I think. And it was, you know, hundreds of pounds because it came with a set of manuals that were like twice as wide as I can fit on the screen. So we had to put up a whole new shelf for the manuals for it. But you know, that was what it was like before Stack Overflow, as you know. So yeah, timing was great. GitHub was new. I used Ruby, which was, you know, it just got to the point where everyone was thinking Ruby was like the best thing ever. Ruby on Rails had like really solidified that. Ruby on Rails was relatively new. I used Ruby for a variety of reasons, partly because I wanted to learn it. It looked cool, and it is cool. I miss working in Ruby. It's a lovely language. And because it came with the Mac. And I wanted Brew to be this thing where all you had to do was clone the repository and it would just work. I don't think that's true anymore, but it was the case. Because I know how when you're like competing with existing tools, and MacPulse was basically the one everyone used, you have to be as easy as possible to get started with, to get up to speed, and not require them to learn really anything at all, because they're only going to give you about 2 minutes if they even try it at all. So you've got to catch them in the README, and you've got to catch them with the tool being really simple and wonderful to use. So yeah, it was really simple and wonderful to use. And I had fun with the naming scheme. You know, I called it Homebrew because I was in the pub and I asked my friend if he could help me come up with a naming scheme for my cool new package manager idea. And he said, beer, obviously. But we were in the pub. So, and I was like, oh, beer, Homebrew. And it just fitted perfectly because I was trying to build this tool that you could customize how the packages worked, because that's what I needed as a developer. Now, you know, I built Homebrew to do that. You can't really do that with Homebrew anymore. But at the time, it was a cool feature. I'm trying to bring that kind of thing back a bit more again. But this is the thing, because like Brew evolved into a system packager for everybody, not just for developers, for anyone who uses a Mac. I've had emails from people of all walks of life who don't really understand the terminal in general, but they've made an exception so they can install something that Homebrew has because they need it for some reason or another. So, you know, that changed, and we weren't afraid to change what Homebrew was to cater to who was using Homebrew. And so, like, you know, there's all these little factors that made Brew like phenomenally successful. And there's videos out there where you can see like just how many people got involved in the project. It's insane. Like we say that Homebrew is the open source project with the most unique contributors of any software project ever. And we haven't proved it, but I'd be amazed if that's not true. And that was partly because I made it so easy to get involved. Like I baked in commands, sub-commands on the main command so that you could add new formula to Brew. And then it's built on top of Git. So you just make a pull request straight in the repo. And it's, you know, it was all carefully considered. Like, I don't think I've ever spent as much of my time figuring out how to make something work as I did with Brew. There was just something in the back of my mind, like after I started building it, I was like, this is going to be a success. This is going to work. I don't know how I knew it. And then when it did, I was like, I knew it. I was like, thanks for your praise, but I knew it was going to work.
So what gave you the initial idea for it?
Well, it's a combination of frustrations working at Last.fm. We had like 6 different apps, and they all used mostly the same collection of open source, but different platforms, different tool sets, different build systems. I wanted something that I could bring all that together so that instead of wasting 40% of our time like debugging like build system issues and deployment issues, we were using that 40% to get on with things. So I was saying before, like when I'm frustrated, I just try and figure out how to remove those frustrations. And so I've just been interested in package managers since I got into programming, and since I got into Linux. Like I loved the fact that Linux came with this tool that allowed you to easily install new tools. Like it was the App Store before app stores, basically. And so I experimented with loads of different Linux distributions, trying to find the perfect package manager. And there is no perfect package manager, but the process of going through that, I learned all the neat things from these ones, and this one has this cool feature. And if you combine these 2 ideas, then maybe you'd have something excellent. Like Brew was the only real package manager at the time that I knew that did the symlinks thing, where the file system became the database. And I didn't do that because I was scared of databases. I was scared of databases, but that wasn't the reason. It's because I wanted the user to be able to use like the file system tools that came with their computer to be able to do things with their package manager. I wanted you to just be able to type ls and you knew what was installed. You didn't have to learn how Brew worked. You could just open Finder and browse and see what you had installed. Like with most package managers, you have to Google to figure out what you had installed on the system. And like things like apt, Debian's package manager, it was a really cryptic command, and you had to run it through grep half the time. It seemed ludicrous to me. So yeah, it was frustrations, and also I become very fond of them and wanted to make my own. It just sort of happened, and that's how it happened. Like I was complaining in the pub one evening after work about how we were wasting all this time trying to figure out like why CMake wasn't building something properly on one of the platforms and not the others. And one of my friends just challenged me to do something about it because he was fed up with me moaning about the problems we were having. So I went home and just started it that day.
Yeah, I feel like even JavaScript package managers are still like catching up, like, PNPM and symlinks and stuff. Like they're still just getting there.
Well, for a lot of people, building these things is kind of an afterthought because they need the functionality, but they're not too interested in making it. I think that's how a lot of these package managers end up, starting. And it's not common that you get someone like me that for some reason really wants it to be a lovely product. I don't want to poo-poo over all the other things that are out there, but I think that happens a lot.
Yeah, and at this point, it's like just table stakes, You make a new language, got to make a new package manager, and it's just like a tick on the list. Yeah. It's not like a product in and of itself the way you viewed Brew. So it was like...
sorry.
Go ahead.
Like language package managers were a very sensible innovation. And really the first one I knew about was NPM. And I knew about it because we packaged NPM with Brew. And then Isaac came along and said, can you stop doing that? And we had an argument about it for like a week. And then he wrote a blog post about how the two great package managers reconciled their differences. Because in the end, I was like, well, you're the maintainer of this thing. If you don't want to improve, then I respect that. And so we removed it, but now it's back in. I don't know how anyone feels about that. I stopped working on Brew in about 2015, 2016. So since then, it's been run by the community. And I stopped working on it because I could. The community was huge and it stepped up, and it was what I needed it to be.
So this is probably like a good segue to talk about a little bit about like money and how you pay the bills at Brew. Like you're hosting a bunch of packages, right? You got to have infrastructure. You got to have bills that are coming your way. How are you able to keep up with that? Was Brew
And you quit
earning
your
any
job
money?
at, I was going to say, and you said you quit your job at Last FM. So.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I carefully designed Brew so that it wouldn't cost me anything apart from my time, initially, at least. So, that's it was hosted on GitHub. I didn't have to pay for that. And we didn't actually bottle anything. So we didn't build binaries for distribution initially. You had to compile everything from source. Now, I wanted to build binaries because it was only for Mac at the time and it was pretty easy. But yeah, like storage, I didn't have any money for storage. After a few years, Mike McQuaid started a Kickstarter for Homebrew to buy some infrastructure. And it raised a reasonable amount of money, like $11,000 or $12,000. So that helped with some of the ongoing costs that the project was starting to have at that point. But initially, yeah, carefully designed it to be costless. But yeah, personally though, I quit Last FM with very little in the bank, with no real idea about what I'd do when I ran out. And I was just like working 18-hour days basically, and ignoring when the sun came up and not thinking about my bank balance. And like the bills were piling up. The local council in London were threatening to sue me, I think, at one point. And so yeah, I had to go back to work. And the truth is, like, my career has been one of cycles where I save up some money and then quit and work on open source. And I've worked on lots of different open source projects over the years. Homebrew is by far the one that had the most interest and the one I'm proudest of for sure. But I'm a serial open sourcery person, frankly, and I just it's not that I really believe in like those sort of freedoms like some of the people who are so into open source do. I'm not like Richard Stallman. I'm not like GNU. I'm not like the Freedom Free Software Foundation or anything. I think software works better when it's out there for everybody to use and look at and contribute to and be a part of. You have to build things that work with each other. So it just appeals to me. But yeah, I've had to cycle between jobs for my entire professional career.
Yeah, which is very unfortunate for somebody who contributed so much back, right? So many, not even, you didn't even contribute the bricks. It's like you contributed the way to deliver the bricks, which is just absolutely foundational. So you had to be a little frustrated, right? Saying like, maybe there's a better way to be,
Yeah. Well, indeed.
to be compensated for.
I've, every time I got a new job, and then after a few months, I was like, I'd rather be working on open source. So I'd like try and think of ways to make it so I could work in open source full time. Now, there is sponsorship programs nowadays that work. Back when I was working on Brew, there wasn't really. You could appeal for donations, but I didn't like doing that. I never liked doing that. I did try it a couple of years ago. I was in between jobs again, and I had some cool open source ideas. So I tried to get a Patreon running, and after a few months, I still hadn't breached $1,000 a month. So it's difficult. It's really difficult. Like not everyone's a Sindri Soros, so how do you say his last name?
Yeah,
that guy. I'm proud of him. I wrote to him when I was trying to get my Patreon up, and I was like, "Can you give me some tips?" And he was helpful, but the truth is, like, he spent years building that up to the point where he now is paid by a lot of people to work on open source full time. Difficult to do, and the biggest issue I had running the Patreon was that I felt I was spending like 40% of my time marketing myself.
Yep.
And I'm always trying to get rid of that 40% of wasted time. So yeah, I've long thought about what maybe could be done to fix funding open source, and so that's what T is. And so T is. I never thought I'd make another brew. I quit in 2016 or so. I'm not the kind of person really to repeat things, and also replacing my previous success kind of feels wrong in some levels, I have to say. But over the years, though, I still kept notes on what I could do with a new brew, what a package manager could be. Because the truth is, there's so much potential at this layer, underneath all other developer tools. It actually feels really weird that nobody has experimented with adding functionality and features on top of that. And so T is Brew 2 as such. It's not meant to replace Brew. In many ways, it's a complement. It's a much more powerful package manager for developers, really heavily focused on developers. But also, and this is how it came to be a funded company. Me and my fiance, we got pregnant about a year or so ago. We were trying, but the gynecologist told us it would probably take 12 months. So at the time, I was hacking on open source, and I had some savings. And I was like, oh, that's okay. I've got 12 months to figure out how to turn some of this open source into something that I can work on and live off. And then 2 weeks after we started trying, she got pregnant. And the next morning, after we were happy, next morning I woke up in a cold sweat. I was like, what am I going to do? So I ransacked all my ideas. I went through a huge number of notes, and one of the ideas was Brew 2. And I was like, okay, certainly could get some traction behind trying to do a new brew. But what's the key value prop that's different enough that it's worth doing something new? Because I don't do things just for the sake of it. It has to have something there that will get people's attention and then make them see that this is actually worthy of being a new product. So I didn't have that. But I've got this friend, Timothy Lewis, who I've known for about 10 years. And he got into crypto really early, and he's been trying to get me into crypto. So, hey, Max, you can write Solidity digital contracts. This was 2016, $500 an hour. I'm like, wow, that's impressive money for sure. But, I've never been that influenced by money. It's the truth of it. If I'm not interested in the work, I don't want to do it. So I kept saying, well, that's very interesting, Tim. But I don't know, not for me. So he called me while I was looking through all my notes, and he was like, hey, we're calling it Web3 now. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I was like, it can't possibly be a whole new web, can it? How does that make sense? But when you have the bravado, the guts to say, yeah, this is a whole new web, you get people's attention. So I looked into it. I was like, if they have the guts to say this, there must be something there. And then I started to see that I'd missed a lot of things that were going on there. And the whole what you can do with digital contracts, well, a lot of it was just finance tools that didn't interest me very much, and I didn't really understand. I started to see how NFTs were doing something a little interesting, and that was mainly I think NFTs are a little silly, honestly, but OpenSea had a digital contract where if you resold your NFT, the original creator got 10%, and you can't get around that. Or at least I thought you couldn't get around it. I've now learned that you can, but that's being fixed. Supposedly, see, there's an Ethereum ERC for it, so I was thinking about that and thinking about Brew, and then I suddenly had this moment of inspiration where I saw that the open source graph is this hugely complicated dependency tree, but with digital contracts you could automate payments to the dependencies, and that's really the problem, right? It's you can sponsor a project, but there's 200,000 open source projects. Like companies like Microsoft, they probably use 60 to 70,000 open source projects. Facebook the same, GitHub, for example. How on earth do you compensate all those people? But if everyone sticks their packages into a blockchain and we use digital contracts to distribute some token value all the way down the dependency stack, So dependencies are getting a lot less, like a smaller percentage, but they're dependencies, so they're depended on by loads of things. Essentially, you're automating, like actually paying for open source in the open source ecosystem. So at the time, it was like, half-hearted idea, but I called up Tim, and he was like, yes, we definitely need to do that. And so he has good contacts in the Web3 space, went around, did a round of funding. And so, yeah, we've been working on it for like about 9 months at this point. Essentially, it's going to be, it's going to be a really amazing package manager. Like some of these features that I'm putting into it, it's just, I think it's potentially transformative for development. As I say, like there's so much you can do at that layer, and it's just not been done for some reason. So we're doing that. But also, you don't have to use T to participate in what we're doing on the blockchain. Like T, something I emphasize is that T is a client of the blockchain. So the company is actually, we have a separate division that is going to run the blockchain component that's separate from what we've got, and they're a non-profit. And and also like people assume when I talk about it that you're going to like type T install node and then you're going to get charged like 0.1 cents or something, and it's not going to be like that either. I couldn't change the fundamental way open source works and be a success. Like you just can't do that. It's not going to work. So we have this indirect payments model essentially, where if you want to participate, and what I'm hoping is going to happen, right, is that everyone's going to like give Microsoft and GitHub and Facebook an awful lot of hassle if they don't stick like a few $1 million a year into the open source ecosystem using T as the distribution method, the T blockchain. So it gives people the capability of actually sponsoring the open source stuff. They say they want to, but it's very difficult to. Like I have this other open source project, Promise Kit, which I still maintain to a certain extent. At one point, it had 100,000 apps using it. It's this iPhone framework. I'm pretty sure it doesn't anymore. I'm not really sure what the stats are now. But I realized that if everyone who used it just gave me $1 a year, that would more than pay for me to be able to work on it. It's only $1, so that was part of the genesis of this idea as well. Like, I want every developer to put at least $1 into the open source ecosystem they use, and T will know exactly what packages you're using across all the package managers. But where was I going with that?
Well, I could ask some questions here. I think one of the cool things about T then is it makes it really easy to make decisions about like who you're sponsoring, who you're donating to. Because like, let's put it this way. If you want to make a donation, you're going to look at the top of the funnel of the dependency graph. You're going to give it to React or Vue or some like major piece that you're using. But that kind of ignores all of the building blocks underneath. So it makes it really easy to just say like stick it in T and it will trickle down to even the smallest of the small foundational packages. But I kind of want to ask, like, how do you determine what percentage of the tree gets what percentage of the donation? Because you can't say the size in megabytes of the package or something like that. That just doesn't work. How do you determine that?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and we're still figuring the details out. We have a white paper that describes it in some detail, but we're not going on usage per se. So, like, when you T install something, it's not going to like add one somewhere and then like give that package more token as a result.
Right.
For several reasons. Like one, I don't think it's fair, but also because putting data on a blockchain is expensive. Turns out very expensive, depending on the chain. But the truth is, the chains that have very cheap gas fees, as they call them, have huge spam problems. So I don't know how that's going to work out. Like it's fascinating, actually, blockchain stuff. I didn't realize what I was missing. It's very clever, and there's so much game theory and human psychology in it. Like you're essentially just designing things all the time to be correctly incentivizing for the participants, but not so incentivizing that bad behavior happens, and not like so weak that people can like start doing scams and shit on top of it. So we will use the dependency graph as the main thing, right? So like if you are a dependency like OpenSSL, for example, you're a dependency of like 10,000 packages. So that is for a start, it's irrefutable. Like these other packages wouldn't depend on you if you weren't useful.
Yeah.
So we know you're useful. So that gives, we'll say everything above OpenSSL will give OpenSSL a little bit of their rewards all the way to the top. And then you've got the top, and the top is the problem, right? How do you get people, how do you know what's used at the top? What's worth putting some token in? So our system that we talk about in our white paper is, we call it steeping. And so we're going to have participants in open source, developers, companies, choose the packages they want to steep. And then those will receive periodic rewards, because essentially we use a proof of stake blockchain, and then periodically we put a bit of token into that. That's a reward. And then some of that reward goes to the people steeping to encourage them to do it. It's like banks giving you interest payments, essentially. And then part of that reward will go all the way down the chain. And then because that might just lead to certain packages getting too much, like, your favorite, like React or Solid.js or something, getting too much, we'll have a system that reduces the rewards if you get too many people going on it, on a sensible mathematical relationship for that. And we'll also have a system which encourages people to find new packages that are exciting and give them extra rewards for that. So, the top is the hard bit to get right, but the dependencies as usage really works. So libc right down at the bottom, glibc, extremely important piece of software, been maintained for 30 years. You go to the website and I don't think they get much at all. And there's other classic examples, like is it JS Core or Core JS? Essentially, it's like every node package that exists, every node app that exists uses this thing. And you go there and they're desperate for money. Like, please, we can barely afford to maintain this thing that if it breaks, the entire internet will stop working.
I think that was like the first ask for funding that ever showed up in the NPM install logs was Core.js. Yeah. So,
and they still get very little because it's not exciting, right? Yeah. Like it's vital, but it doesn't make you go, oh, that's warm and fuzzy, I want to give them money. So yeah, you need some kind of automated system that understands the dependency graph. I think it'll work.
So help the listeners understand, how does Web3 play a role in T specifically? So it helps distribute the funding by leveraging the blockchain and the contracts on the blockchain and depositing that into like the owners of the contracts wallets. Like, kind of walk through that flow and what Web3 enables there.
Yeah, so Web3 is an encompassing term that mostly is about blockchain technologies, like Bitcoin being the original, and then Ethereum being like the number 2, and then the dozens and dozens of other shit coins that have turned up over time. But it's also about decentralization, which, like open source originally was much more decentralized than it is nowadays. And I'm proud of the fact that we're going to be helping bring back some of that decentralization, taking open source hopefully out of the hands of corporates to some extent. Like, it's become very corporate. Microsoft, Facebook, GitHub, Google, they all do a lot of the big open source projects nowadays. It used to be people like myself who just were trying to work on open source full time and failing. So yeah, as a package maintainer, you will put an NFT into our blockchain. And so there's no JPEGs associated with our NFTs. I hope my co-founder kind of wants to put some JPEGs on them. But NFT is essentially, it's just an immutable data point, essentially. An immutable data point that you can do a few other things with. So it goes in the blockchain and it represents an immutable package release. We think this is very important. Like, everyone remembers the left pad incident, and other things like that happen every now and again, where maintainers basically break parts of the internet by removing their open source. Okay,
so each NFT is directly tied to a specific release of a package.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
And so there will be a small amount of data, because you don't want to put too much data on a blockchain. Essentially a name. So we're doing unique names for packages, which is, every package manager calls everything slightly differently, and that's annoying. So we're hoping to solve that. a unique identifier, a version, a semantic version. We're going to force semantic versioning on all of open source. That's one of the nice things we're going to I'll talk about in a minute. But you can do some neat things when you have an incentive system in place on our blockchain like we have. And then the dependency information. So what it depends on. And there's build dependencies and runtime dependencies and optional dependencies and things like that. So we'll encode that and a hash representing the hash of the source tuple. We might do some signing above and beyond just the blockchain signing. But of course, everything's cryptographically secure with blockchain. So if you trust that this package owner actually signed that particular package, and we're going to have systems in place to help everybody see that it was actually the node foundation that signed this node release, for example. So those NFTs will act like a map for how the token is directed through the chain. So whenever token comes in above a dependency, the token will then look at that NFT for that release and see the dependencies and then funnel it to the next one and funnel it to the next one, and funnel it to the next one. All automated, all done digitally in contracts, by digital contracts, cryptographically secure. It's quite beautiful, really. So, that the Web3 side is like the cryptography side, but also we're going to put everything in decentralized storage. So it's available for everybody in a decentralized fashion. And you can always build a centralized, proxy in front of a decentralized store. But what you need is the decentralized store to start with. And you need someone like T to make the decision to actually properly put all the source code in decentralized storage, make it accessible in a unified and easy to understand format. And we're decentralizing as much as possible as we build it in general.
How does this work in the case where, because you said each NFT, each package essentially has one owner at a time. How does this work where,
Yes.
packages are obviously having many contributors? How do you also credit those contributors or organizations that do these packages?
Yeah, great question. And it's one we have been discussing internally quite a bit recently, actually. So the design as it stands is there is one wallet for the package, and it doesn't represent a person, it represents the package. So in Web3, there's these things called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And what we're going to suggest is that projects that have like a contributor base form a DAO. And then you build the digital contracts for that DAO on top of our blockchain. And then you can have voting for how the funds are released to the members of that DAO. So you'll probably have some core contributors who get a reasonable amount because they've said they're going to work full time on this project. And they will be expected to, right? Because now suddenly there's some expectations in how open source works. And then maybe you want to give a bit of token to everyone who's opened a pull request last month. Mm-hmm. Or people who've helped with the README or translated. You can suddenly have actual tasks in the README and say, hey, if you translate our README and keep it up to date, right? Because that's a big problem with translations in open source. They fall behind almost immediately. If you translate our README, keep it up to date, we'll give you X token. So a person who's good at that can then find 50 projects, enter their DAOs, and be paid maybe enough. Maybe that's enough. You figure out the math yourself. We believe that the right solution is to say each project figures out its own DAO. We're going to provide suggested templates for there's this one here where, you have core contributors and the money just goes to them. And then there's this one here where it understands how pull requests work. And here's a system you can bolt on that will then figure out how to distribute the token and then cryptographically sign it and then do the transfers for you. But I think this is an area where the open source community needs to figure out what it's going to be. We'll provide the tooling so that they can build these things. And I'm excited to see what ideas they'll have, honestly. Yeah. But the truth is, the vast majority of open source projects, it's one person.
Yeah, but it does make my mind run wild a little bit. I had this kind of fantasy where developers are just transient people working across companies where every issue that's open has a bounty or a payment associated with it. And you would work on this project, or this project, pick an issue, deliver it. You'd get your little piece of that token or Bitcoin or whatnot. And you could work on whatever pleases you and get a paycheck somehow, bit by bit.
Brad, you just gave me the tingles.
Right? Yeah. It's kind of cool to think about that. Yeah.
But my dream is that everyone who works at Facebook quits to work on open source. That's my dream here, right? Because there's some extremely talented developers that work at these FANG companies. And then what are they doing with their talents? They're not making the world of software better, mostly. You know, like investing like what talent you have in like making a like algorithm work better is just a shame.
Yeah, but then, you know, there's a dystopian side to it too. I can see where when everything is associated with a payment, you know what they say, like as soon as you turn your hobby into kind of a paid thing, a job, you start to lose interest. So, you know, you walk that fine line where it feels good to get rewarded versus I have to continue doing this work to get paid. And, you know, everybody has the freedom of choice there. You can go work for somebody else or you can go work for yourself on this open source stuff and try to get paid that way. Yeah. But you don't want to suck the joy out of it. And that comes down to an individual level of where you contribute and how you gain your income.
Yeah, well, it's a really good point, frankly. And we all know how it can become joyless. But, you know, we're giving people the option.
Exactly. Yeah.
You don't have to take any token. So you can continue to have open source work the way it currently does. And then, you know, when you're working 2 jobs like I often was, that was your choice.
Yeah, at least it's a lucrative side project at that point. Yeah. So kind of like last question, how is it going so far? Like, what kind of adoption are you seeing on T? Have you distributed any tokens or funds? Just like, what's the state of the union?
Yeah, so we're still relatively early days, but having said that, I've been working constantly on the thing with a few other people for the last 9 months, and we're hoping to release what we call T-CLI, the package manager, essentially, in November. So fingers crossed, I reserve the right to hold it off if I don't think it's ready. You know, whenever I do open source, I keep it private until I feel that, okay, it's ready. And usually that's when I spend like 4 days reworking the README constantly until I feel that you could read this and understand what it is that you found. So yeah, hopefully T-CLI November with a subset of all the cool features, some of the more important ones. And we don't have a testnet or a mainnet for the token yet. We're thinking probably sometime next year, actually, for the testnet. So currently you can go to our GitHub and our website is open source and our white paper is open source. I was quite pleased about that. We spent a while making it so the white paper is markdown that gets converted into a PDF using Pandoc and LaTeX. And we have an automated system for translations on it as well. Because I'm coming into this with the understanding that open source is absolutely a global phenomenon. And I don't want any country to not have access to what we're building and have issues. So I'm translating the package manager, and we're translating the website, and we're translating the white paper. So you can go there and you can check it out. But yeah, we haven't got anything that's particularly interesting out yet. You'll wait till November. But in the meantime, if you go to t.xyz, you can authenticate with T. It will open up your GitHub account, ask for permissions to look at your open source, because we want to know who has some open source, because we're going to give you some token if you have some open source, because we're going to basically ensure that when the mainnet does go live, the people who have the most influence in there, because the whole thing is going to have its own DAO as well. So everyone who participates will be able to vote on how it's run. Like I say, the blockchain will be run by an independent nonprofit. So T Incorporated, which is the company that's making the package manager, we're going to have like an app and some other things. It doesn't have control over that once it goes live. We're building it to start with. So we have control currently. So yeah, I suggest going to XYZ authenticating because there will be a reward as long as you have some open source.
I gotta say, you're picking the perfect time to be walking around talking about open source because it is
Yes.
Hacktoberfest. I'm repping
I
the
noticed your
t-shirt.
shirt.
It's really an opportune time to launch this product and go around talking about it. And I think like it's pretty desperately needed. Open source can be thankless, and I think you're kind of trying to bring the joy back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's absolutely our goal to not change the fundamentals of how open source works, but make it so it's feasible for the people who are passionate about open source and would rather be working on open source full time and have made such important contributions to the entire world of software to have a reasonable option for being able to do that as their jobs.
Are we doing on time, Amy? You want to move into
Yeah,
pick some
we're a
plugs?
little we're a little close. Is it
Okay.
okay if we just skip that section and I'll just let you plug? I'll announce it. We can edit this section out. Okay, awesome. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I just want to say one, thank you, Max, for joining us. Where can people find you, and how can they contribute to what you're doing?
Well, we are t.xyz. I was pretty pleased when we managed to pick that domain up. We didn't have to pay a domain scummer for it even, because the XYZ domains are very expensive. That's how they should be. So that's our website's got the white paper on it. It links to our GitHub. You can find everything there, and you can authenticate with T there, which you should definitely do. Everyone should do. There's going to be a reward for doing so when we go live.
Awesome. I was just checking. I think in a couple, let's see. It's like in a couple of weeks, we will be interviewing Elaine Wagner. So he will be next up on the list. But again, just want to say thank you, Max, for joining us. And thank you, Brad, for co-hosting with me. So until then, that's all we got. Sweet. So I know we are a little past an hour and just want to be respectful of your time. So we can go ahead and end the show, but just appreciate you again. And thanks again, Brad.
Yeah, this was awesome, Max. It's got me pretty excited to go check it out and see what it's all about. This is a really good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is as well. I try to be humble about these things, but I think it's going to work, and it's also going to be this kick-ass product as well. I'm a big believer that you can't just. I think a lot of the Web3 stuff that's happened over the last few years hasn't succeeded because all it is a blockchain component. You need a use case. So I came at it knowing that I also had to make a kick-ass package manager and a kick-ass packaging suite. And we're calling it basically packaging infrastructure because part of what we're doing is building it into like Git, right? It was when it was released, they called it plumbing and porcelain. So it was all these little pieces of plumbing, which were like little scripts that were then combined into bigger scripts called the porcelain. So they provided the primitives so you could build a version control system. And they built their own. So we're providing essentially a set of plumbing for packaging and then porcelain, which is the T-CLE. And I'm hoping that that's going to make it so people, when when the new programming language comes out and they have to make a package manager, they'll build it with the T primitives.
Yeah.
And hopefully some of the other package managers that exist will retrofit what they've got with our primitives so that they have less to do, but they can do more as a result. Also, I anticipate people making entirely new kinds of packaging things. I want someone to make a font app store, for example.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Use the T primitives to just really quickly build that out. So then all you're working on is basically just a UI for it. All you need is an idea for some kind of platform that needs distribution.
Gaming, dude. Gaming is a market for that, for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking a mod manager. I don't know if you've ever tried to use a mod manager for some of these video games. They're always terrible. But hopefully they can be a lot better because the base is now essentially there's a package for packaging, essentially.
Very cool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit in broadcast. So that'll end everything. But thank you, everybody.